Well, hello, it's Ben with the DIY Homefront, and today I'm working on my wife's Kia Optima. It's a 2019 year model, and I think it's the last year they made the Optima. At any rate, it's got the 1.6 liter turbo engine, and I'm going to replace the serpentine belt. So let's take a look and see what we got. Well, here's the drive belts, and the owner's manual says check it at 60,000 miles, and then check it or inspect it every 12,000 miles after that. So I have been checking this serpentine belt, but the car's got almost 150,000 miles, and even though it still looks good, I'm just going to replace it because one of these days it's just going to break. Well, on this car, the alternator is going to be what actually puts tension on the belt, and if you look down there you can see a pulley. A lot of cars will have that mounted on a tensioning spring, and that will apply the tension to the belt. And in some ways that makes it easier because there's no adjustment. Mine has one of those torque bits on the outside, definitely not a bolt. But it's very possible it could be the same thing. We'll just have to take it out and look and see. Well, if you've got a 2009 to 2014 F-150 pickup truck, I've got quite a few videos about that too. Well, you can see how our engine's laid out, and this is actually a 12 millimeter. And I'm going to go ahead and loosen this because this is the lock nut. And now this is the one that you would actually turn to tighten it. And I'm going to go ahead and loosen that up. And we should have one bolt on the bottom. And that looks like it's going to be maybe a 14. So what we have is a 14 millimeter bolt on the bottom and a 12 millimeter bolt on the top. And those two bolts hold the alternator in place. Well, here's our alternator. And the bolt I'm got to get loosened is this one. It's on the bottom. Well, the car might have 150,000 miles on it, but everything is really clean, and all I've got to do is just break this bolt free. We just need to loosen it up. Next, there's an idler pulley that has a pressed-in bearing, and we're going to go ahead and replace that as part of replacing the belt. And it didn't take much effort at all to break this bolt loose. Of course, the downside with front-wheel drive cars is that the engine is in sideways, so there's not a whole lot of room on this side of the engine to get to anything. One thing you will want to do is take off your watches and your rings. Now this is a whole lot easier with this 1.6 liter turbo because the engine isn't as big. On some of the cars you have to take the front wheel off because this portion of the engine is a lot farther forward. And you can see I'm struggling more or less to try to get the camera where you can see what I'm doing than I am trying to get the bolts out. This is when I realized why the replacement pulley doesn't have a bolt on the side. It's got a recessed torque bit, and that's because there's really not enough room to even put a socket on this bolt before you end up hitting the frame rail of the car. Well, I sped this up a little bit because it took a while for me to get that bolt out. And I'm doing this by feel because I can't see what my hand's doing. I got the camera down there, but I can't see anything that's going on. I am pretty sure that is the same thing. Well, unfortunately, you learn things after the fact, and I have learned something after the fact about this bolt that holds this pulley in place. Now, I chose to go ahead and take the recessed torque bit out and reuse the bolt that held the original pulley on. But that was something I was not supposed to do. The guidance says to replace the bolt when you replace the pulley. And I'm assuming because, believe it or not, sometimes bolts are meant to be stretched when they get torqued on, and they're not meant to be reused because when you put them on and you torque them down, you end up deforming the bolt. So it's a once only use bolt. A lot of times you'll find those bolts on the manifolds, the bolts that hold the exhaust onto the engine block. But at any rate, I didn't do that. I reused the bolt. Now let's go ahead and get that serpentine belt off. Well, I'm going to loosen up the tensioner on the alternator a little more, and after I do that, I should be able to get the grooved belt off. There's no cracking anywhere. A lot of times you get cracking. One thing I did notice is where it's joined together, starting to look a little bit rough right there. But really, it doesn't look bad at all. And this is a premium brand, and that is going to be a replacement belt. Like always, I will leave information about these parts in the video description. I didn't mention this before, but the most important thing you do before you pull that belt off is make sure that you look to see how it went on. Because it can be pretty confusing once the belt's off and you've got the new one in your hand, trying to figure out how it went around all the different pulleys. The most important thing is to remember that the V groove always ends up in V pulleys, and that there's a couple of flat pulleys that the flat side will ride on. Now the idler pulley that we took off is going to go right here onto that stud. That's why you take your watches off. Right there, that's where that's going to go. I need two hands though. Can you see? I think in some ways it's mandatory if you're working on cars that just sort of mumble under your breath or sometimes use colorful words to explain what's going on. Eventually I got the nut started and I went ahead and put it on as far as I could by hand before I used a 14mm wrench to tighten it up. Of course, I dropped the wrench a couple of times, but that's part of being a mechanic. I traded that wrench for a socket because that made it a whole lot easier to tighten up that bolt. And I can't tell you how tight I made it, I just made it that tight. If I were to break out my torque wrench, it should be between 25 and 28 foot-pounds of torque. Still spins freely. Let's snug it up a little more. If you're not using a torque wrench, it really is a judgment call. You don't want to get them too tight because you'll just shear the bolt off and then you'll have a different problem. Okay, the belt is on. The pulley I took off is back on. Now it's time to go ahead and tighten up that belt. I remember the old days where you'd take a pry bar and you'd pry down the alternator and then tighten it up. But this is a lot more controlled. I think what I'll do is I will leave it right there, and then in a couple days I will check it and see where we're at. Now there's the one lower bolt that I need to tighten up, and then the last thing to do is to tighten up the upper bolt. Alright, you've seen me replace the serpentine belt and idler pulley. This job is done. The car has 150,000 miles on it, so I like to check the oil once or twice in between oil changes just to make sure that it hasn't burned any oil and the oil level is alright. Now I'll probably come back and check the tightness of this belt in a day or two. Well, I shouldn't have anything to complain about because that 1.6 liter engine has plenty of room around it. It's a whole lot easier to put the belt on that engine than it is the 2.4 liter. But hopefully if you watch this, you saw me do it, you have some confidence or you have an idea of what you're going to do, and it makes the job just that much easier. Well, other than that, like, subscribe, check out my playlist, and I'll see you in that next video.